introduce Dr. Rahul Oka as today's Capitalism's Colloquium speaker. Dr. Oka earned his PhD at the University of Illinois at Chicago and is currently an associate professor at the University of Notre Dame, where he is faculty in the Department of Anthropology, as well as the Keough School of Global Affairs. Dr. Oka is interested in trading communities across the globe and has conducted extensive fieldwork in Southeast Asia and Eastern Africa. His research incorporates both ethnographic and archaeological data into cross-cultural and historical studies of the emergence of markets, inequality, and conflict. His research into the role of traders and trading systems across time and space provides a long-term perspective on exchange, trade networks, and markets, and informs his analysis of capitalism as an enduring part of human history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rahul Oka.
Thank you, and if you could send me that, because that's much better than what I have on my it's a great summary. And thank you again to the department for inviting me, and to all of you for coming and spending this time listening to me talk. And I just wanted to begin by saying that it is indeed an honor to be at Penn. When I was 5 or 6 years old, I played catch with Greg Cosell, or so I was told. I can't remember it that far back, but my granduncle was an archaeologist. He worked on Harappan archaeology in Keough, and so my other uncle was also an archaeologist, and so it kind of became a family thing. But I have to say that they were not my influences for getting into archaeology. Indiana Jones was. But then my mother took me to Deccan College in Pune, where my granduncle then was the director, to actually tell me, yes, it might not be as exciting, but grave robbing might not be the thing to do. And then I got there, and I think some of Greg's grad students were there from Penn, and I saw these cool-looking American, I think, young men and women sitting there measuring pot shards and bones from Colloquium, I think, one of the sites in India. And I just fell in love with the idea of knowledge for the sake of knowledge. And then that started the whole process. And then I became an archaeologist and a cultural anthropologist. So I do wear two hats, because today I'm going to talk about capitalisms, and I'm going to defend capitalism. As you may have seen from my abstract, it's a tongue-in-cheek reference to Jeremy Bentham's defense of usury. And like Bentham, I'm trying to, look at not saying that capitalism is this wonderful, sweet, amazing thing that will save the world, but let's take a step back and consider it for what it actually might be, and especially if it does exist in the world, rather than demonizing it or essentially making judgments about it, political judgments about it, we need to understand it from various levels before we can actually tackle some of its outcomes. Okay, so as I said, this is a realist and implicit views from the archaeology and ethnography of trade, exchange, and markets. And so this is, I looked for popular definitions of capitalism, and I essentially found everything from it is the salvation and the source of all the great things in the world, which is often wrongly attributed to Adam Smith. It is also, and when you go to the other side of the spectrum, it is essentially a device of Satan himself, or herself, or themselves. And so the way I kind of look at it is a winner-take-all Darwinian system of competition-based system of privately owned production and distribution and consumption that either fairly rewards the meritorious, so it creates this society in which if you work hard, you advance, if you don't, tough luck, or it unfairly enables the rich to grow richer, leaving the poor to become poorer. And both of these are actually not mutually incompatible. And this is pretty indefensible, morally speaking, I think, this particular idea, because I think in many ways it kind of creates this straw person before we even begin to analyze what we're talking about. Number two, this is just your straightforward dictionary definition an economic and political system in which a country's trade and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state, and there I add, or any other regulatory authority. And it's objectively defensible as existing, kind of, right? Because one of the things we know, and any business student will tell you, is that doing business in America and doing business in Japan, doing business in China are very, very different things. Which is why business schools are essentially getting all these students signing up for international economics and business classes without actually teaching them about cultural differences. Just, here, take a few shots of the language and then go in and do business. And that's a gap I think that anthropologists can actually fill. But we can't do it if we keep on setting ourselves in opposition. Okay. And the third one is kind of like this broad and general definition that I've created myself, which might be too broad to have any utility, but it's definitely broad enough to have a lot of general applicability. A political economic system based on private or group ownership of trade and industry incentivized by profit, existing in parallel with other political economic systems within the society, where the outcome may include fairly rewarding the meritorious or unfairly enabling the rich to grow rich and leaving the poor to grow poor. As I said, because these were not mutually exclusive categories, even in the first definition, I've decided to leave that ambiguity in there. And the parameters of my defense is that I'm not defending capitalism morally. It's like more defending evolution morally. It's no point. If I want to defend capitalism, evolution, I'm going to defend it as a process that is happening, that can be observed to be happening, and that has outcomes. Now the morality is something that we place upon it ourselves. It's one of many different systems. And right now, just because it dominates, or it looks like it dominates, doesn't mean that it is the only system. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist either. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist before the big bad European went all over the world and destroyed it and made everything capitalist. It existed in many forms, and I see it as an emergent property of needs, expediencies. And very often it's these that determine the form, structure, boundaries, and the limits of capitalism, including role of markets and finance, the regulation of private and public economic activity. And for me, it's a subject and object of analysis, primarily due to its current dominance in global economics, in global economies, but also because it has an enduring history. I mean, one thing when I ask, especially my business students, when were the first hedge funds thought of? And they say, well, maybe about 100 years ago or something like that. And I tell them, no, actually, Mesopotamia, right? In the early second millennium BC. And that is when we actually have institutional records of hedge fund-like investment activities going on with an established merchant group and so on and so forth. And with the very definition of hedging your bets or hedging your investment with high risk, high return, and low risk, low return. So a lot of the things that we think are purely present-day capitalism are actually quite old, and that's not news to anybody here. And I just want to essentially say that, like wherever you think, who would have essentially believed that our Republican Party would essentially stand behind tariffs in this anti-global trade kind of thing? I mean, it was kind of like, in 2003 when the French accused the US of arrogance and the Germans accused the US of warmongering. It's like a topsy-turvy world. And so I mean, things flip around. And which is why I said needs and expediencies are important. And then, of course, when you essentially think about even societies that seem to have completely controlled economies, the Soviet economy, and then you actually look at the fact that it was a black market that both sustained and ultimately eroded the communist state. That without the black market, it was likely that the Soviet Union might have actually collapsed 15 or 20 years before. And Lewis and Longnex has done excellent work on some of these developments that were happening within these states. And this is not really an argument on Polanyi or anything like that. I think we need to move beyond that. Polanyi made a lot of excellent points. His great transformation was a great concept. His idea of his three-tiered system was great, accepting that he came out of a time where he saw a lot of the market economies and capitalism as sort of an evil, this later imposition. And one of the things that we know right now, and that's something that my research has actually tried very hard to establish, is that private trade and markets have existed for a long time. Capitalism-driven markets have always existed in dynamic relationship with social regulatory bodies, and the outcomes of capitalism are hence contingent on a lot of different things. And very often when we decry capitalism or we praise capitalism, what we're looking at the outcomes. The process, however, is something that we need to unpack. And so the two things that I focus on are traders, the actors, and the markets. Now, I'm going to sort of go through these a bit quickly. If you need to get in touch with any of these slides that I have, you want to talk to me about any of these slides, please contact me, and I'm happy to talk to you ad nauseum about this. But what I really want to do is, I want to go through these because I have 96 slides to go through. Yes, I broke my cardinal rule, as you do, of a few slides. And even as I was doing myself, I was thinking, why am I doing this? And then I realized because I did want to tell two stories. And before I tell the two stories, I just want to have a little bit of an introduction as to some of the basis of my thinking, which essentially is based on a study of now I actually have more than like 650 traders from different parts of the world where I've done ethnographies, I've done network analysis, I've collected firm histories and so on and so forth, everything from some of the wealthiest people in the world to peddlers. And the idea was to strip away what we call cultural variation, to essentially say, is there something when business people say business is business is business is business? Or that you can essentially drop any of these traders into the middle of nowhere, and as long as there's humans there, they can trade. And on the basis of this, I created sort of this central approach about where these actors and these forums are important for transitions. And I'm going to go through this quickly. I'll be happy to talk about it in more detail later on. So basically, when traders and the states, it's traders versus the state. Because there's a 3,000-year-old history of traders essentially being called parasites, leeches, being vilified, being scapegoated by political groups and so on and so forth, that they hoard, the smugglers, the black markets, they bribe people, and whenever it's convenient, if your economy is failing, it's always great to point to a bunch of outside traders and say they're the ones who are stealing all the money, and then off go the villagers with the pitchforks and torches. And it still happens to this day. And states try to regulate traders very often through punitive measures, taxation, personal threats, kidnapping, imprisonment, murder, looting, rioting. I mean, one of the best ways to essentially make sure that your traders don't raise your head too much, that they can do whatever they want, they can earn all the money they want, don't interfere with politics, and don't step on our toes. I mean, the most excellent example of that is essentially when in the current Russian oligarchy, when Kordovsky dared to raise his head against Putin, he was obliterated in a way that I still think that he's in a state of shock years after this. And Putin gave a very, very clear message to all the business people. Make as much money as you want. You will not interfere with the state. Right? And so this was actually a norm in most ways. I mean, most of the time that states would relax a lot of these rules, but basically there was no question that the state was at the top. And if a trader wanted to gain some influence, it was what we would call through the diaspora alliance networks. And so I've actually called them trader alliance networks. And basically, this is based on the growing studies of trade networks all over the world, where they ubiquitous. Very often they exist on the margins, but they also exist. They span the margin in the center. They are hated and loved at the same time. They're really easy targets. Like Indians in Africa, the Chinese in Southeast Asia, the Lebanese in Latin America. They're named, and they're tolerated because of their ability to generate credit really quickly, their abilities to build businesses, but they're also very convenient scapegoats. And so what they do is that they draw their strength from networks. And it is almost by design that the networks are transregional and they're just super temporal. Some of the trade networks that I've studied have documented the networks of the Jain traders, and the Jain families go back thousands of years. They might have changed a few things here and there, but basically they claim they can actually trace it back to the early Common Era in India. Now, whether or not you believe that the longevity goes back that much, it definitely extends for a few hundreds of years. And at various levels. We're not just talking large firms. We're essentially talking groups of traders that have been trading for generations after generations. And as I said, they are they're ubiquitous because there's a need for exchange due to resource differences in social relationships. Not everybody is good in everything. So there are people who come across specialists in exchange, and a particular kind of individual who's drawn to building, self-aggrandizing and maximizing. But this, in turn, is actually tempered because you don't want to be the constant target. You know you're a target, so what you do is you try to evolve your own culture centered around exchange. You need to maintain all, not just a few ties. That your life is in between, not in any group. It's in your own group, but for example, how many people know the Indian name Shah is quite, Shah or Patel, it's quite well known, right? Shah and Patel are actually not their last names. Very often they don't even let their last names known, even to fellow Indians, let alone outsiders. These identities actually held quite tight. And basically what happens is that they're on the boundary and they're often accused of no loyalty to anyone. And they're the source of either local good being transferred out or foreign evil coming in. Now, it's not really the case, but that's the narrative, the social causation narrative that is very often built up. In the early 80s, I would see that many times, that any time there was some kind of issue that the price of sugar has suddenly gone up, and suddenly there's a large crowd of people going and attacking the Gujarati or the Marwari trader. And these are the very people on whom the people who are destroying their shops are actually dependent because they gave these short-term credits or even long-term credits. And so, because there's a cyclical nature of interaction, the more they hate it, the more they draw on network, the more they draw on networks, the more they hate it. But they're also loved. But they also, you need them, but you also, and I think partially because of what René Girard calls a mimetic desire that changes to mimetic crisis, you love them for their ability to generate money. You'd like to do it yourself, but you can't. And so, you create these things. So over time, I had an informant tell me, yes, the government tells me that they will protect my interests. But what about our history tells you that you can trust any government? You tell me that yes, this government will protect me. I have 2,000 years of history of my people that will tell me that it won't. And so in this particular case, what happens is that it creates a cyclical nature of interactions. These networks become very strong. And then, so that's why I say that the networks are emergent property of trader relationships. And very often the business strategies tend to be quite conservative. and you tend to constantly reinvest in your networks, and these networks then tend to be resilient, adaptable, they go across all sorts of boundaries. They last for generations. Some networks have gone back into the early common era, if not before. They can outlast states, empires, and eras, and they perform under wars, natural calamities, and other disasters. This I know from my own experience while I do ethnographic research in northern Kenya and in Somalia and in South Sudan, where you don't find it. When the UN and the World Food Programme are running for the hills, it's the Catholic Church, crazy anthropologists like myself, and traders who are actually going in to trade at that particular point. But I definitely know that my networks are not as resilient as these traders. And what happens is that the constant fear and uncertainty leads to a social distance between traders and the others, and you have all these particular groups who are stereotyped. Each of these groups have been stereotyped in their own society. The Jews in Europe, Gujaratis in India and East Africa, Chinese, Lebanese, Yellow, Scots. And very often, these stereotypes are acted out not in the more egregious way that they are narrated, but they're essentially, that they get reinforced because yes, you don't want to make yourself into a target by flaunting your money. But then what happens, you become called a miser. You can't own land, that's why you go into capital and finance and you become a money lender. You're the evil, usurious money lender. And so some of these niches that are occupied by these diasporan groups then feed into these particular stereotypes. And so a lot of these training types that I've interviewed include these particular five groups. And I'm clicking through this because you can read faster than I can talk. You can read faster than I can talk, so I'll rely on you to make sure that you know. So those five trader groups, and these are the activities that they've done, and it has been very interesting to actually do comparative interviews both within cultures and across cultures on groups in each of these. And you know, different groups have different strategies. Some will deal in luxuries, others will deal in necessities, some will small scale, others bulk. Some are just finance, profit and margin versus profit and turnover. And basically, what do you control? Do you control production entrepreneurially? Do you control distribution? Or do you control finance? There are three main things. And is it a service-based or is it about production? And one of the things about these is that when you have unstable or predatory polities, you actually run these networks are really, really great because they're resilient and they can function wonderfully in stable and predatory polities, excepting that by their very nature they're limited. So if there's a predatory polity or an unstable polity, you can conduct your business, your distribution business, but you're not going to build a warehouse. Because building a warehouse essentially means that it can be attacked, and so on and so forth. So one of the ways that people have dealt with these is by institutionalization of network groups, so you get cartels, you get guilds. And guilds are of course limited because they exist in opposition to political elites, and very often the influence has to be subtle. You cannot actually have overt influence. And you have to generate forces for defense sometimes, like the Karanis had their armies, South Indian guilds had their armies. There was a 1074 rebellions against Archbishop Ahmed I in Northern Europe, and it was actually put down. In other places it wasn't. But basically what happened is that you get these cartels, guilds, these crony capitalists, because there's something fundamentally different that actually does happen. It happens at various times for at individual trader level. But there are times in history where this has actually happened at a larger group level, that you get a shift in trade. And you get these large cartels, you get these guilds, or cronies, and by cronies I mean crony capitalism, when certain traders grow very close to the state and they can get what they want done. For most of human history, these have not been an enormous part. of trade. But what they do is that they do bridge these structural holes. This is from network analysis. So here are 4 different trade networks, just for the sake of there's very small trade networks. T1, T2, T3, and T4 are essentially the bridges between these particular networks, and you can actually see that T4 is very central. T4 connects all of these. If you take out T4, these will be one group, but you'll actually have a breakdown of this lot. And so it gives you a lot of power, because when you can bridge things at a global level. And when you have this kind of power, you get influence, and the idea is why defend when you can buy? And why can you buy? Because you're really, really good at generating monies. You're very good at generating credit, and you're very good at moving it across boundaries. And so this is something that I'm going to be talking about. How many of you are familiar with the term moral hazard? Okay. I'll explain it. Just bear with me right now. So this is your usual network-centric trade network, and this is essentially a network where you have a few people who are these brokers. And this is based on my ethnographies, I kind of created this what I would actually call a central mechanism of how shifts are happening, how traders constantly react to their political systems, that when there's favorable regulatory conditions and stability, some traders will intensify political alliances. It leads to a hierarchy in your trader alliance network. If there's a return of instability, it leads to unfavorable regulatory conditions, and then you essentially get a drawdown back to your network system. And this is just a more visual way of actually representing this particular cycle. So here you essentially have all network-dependent traders and who are marginally connected to the political elites. Here you have this one politically connected trader, and the others have power because of this one. And this, I'm not going to go into this right now. This is just a larger trading model that I've created, that I've applied various aspects to at different points. So this was what Sam was talking about a long-term modeling of trade. This is my latest thing, the Trading Complex 5, and I'm not sure yet how these different systems are actually connected to this. But basically, this is what I'm suggesting we're moving towards now, where we have 2 very powerful groups: nation states and nation corporations, like Amazon and so on and so forth, that actually have power beyond a nation state in some ways, but not in others, right? So structurally it might be similar to a guild versus state, but it still remains to be seen. Okay, so for the next 30 minutes, I'm going to run through, and then I'm going to talk about 2 capitalisms and their trade and markets. So one is how capitalism enshrined a global moral hazard, and this is based on my archaeological and ethnographic approach to the early modern era and the great capitalist conversions, focusing on the Indian Ocean. And the second one is actually about capitalism giveth and taketh dignity. Markets. And this is based on the ethno-archaeological, ethnographic, and biocultural approaches to refugee encampment in Kakuma, refugee camp in Kenya. So this is more the archaeological research that I'm doing with Chakusimba and the people at Deccan College in India, and sort of looking towards a partnership with the Upsala Authority in Cambodia. And this is ongoing work with the World Food Program, the UN, and the US State Department in Kenya, and Serbia and Bangladesh. So the first step, how capitalism enshrined a global moral hazard. So you have your popular narrative about how Europe went from nothing circa in the 16th century AD to controlling the entire world practically by the 19th century. And the usual story is that of the Europeans went up, African went down, well, they had naval superiority, and of course the little ice age that affected Africa and Asia very badly. And so the story of African decline, sub-narrative one is basically about how they were unable to ward off the European incursions. And the second one is, of course, there's the story of Frisian resistance, about how despite the European incursion and the eventual takeover, people of Africa and Asia were still resisting. I actually am more in the school of Hilaire Belloc, the Catholic poet, who, when he saw the massacre of the Mahdi's army at Omdurman in 1898, said, whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. Because at that, 10,000 dervishes were killed by the Maxim gun. There were 48 British casualties, and I think they were all friendly fire. People who got in the way of the Maxim gun. The reality, of course, is more complex, and I've written about this in various places, that you had this coterminous sort of crystallization of various factors. You have the emergence of political stability and trade friendliness that led to what I call the Islamic or the imperial détente. The coming together of the Mughal, Safavid, and Ottoman empires. And the reason I call it an Islamic détente is because you have this period of stability and trade friendliness that essentially extends all the way from Europe to South Asia. And then, of course, you have the various empires and polities. And there's a transition from what we call the medieval economy to the early modern economy. And remember the shift that I was talking about before, from the network-centric approach to the more structural to the broker approach. And so from that to what we call state sponsorship or capture. So it's a completely different economic system that we're actually seeing by the end of the early modern era from the medieval period. And the use of credit instruments for capital mobilization and the true emergence of a global moral hazard in the economy. So this is more a cautionary tale of the capitalism tale one. And so just moral hazard, just to give you a refresher, when someone increases their exposure to risk when insured, and when someone else bears the cost of the risks, right? So basically, when young men drive motorcycles and they keep on getting into accidents because they're insured. Risk-taking party to a transaction knows more about the intentions than the party paying the consequence of the risk. That's Goldman Sachs essentially betting against its investors while telling them that there might be a conflict of interest. And then an agent acting on behalf of principal, again Goldman Sachs over here, has more information about his actions than the principal, because the principal cannot monitor the agent. Now, as you can see, moral hazards are big when you have these global actors who can connect disparate things. And this goes back to Samir Amin's analysis of traders, like a Marxist analysis of traders almost. That when you're sitting in the middle and you know the supply, demand, you know the supply and you know the demand, and you know the costs and transactions, you can play off various sides. And usually this is levied at all traders, and personally I find that quite unfair because traders actually do a lot of work where other institutions cannot. But for some groups like Goldman Sachs, I think that that's actually a pretty valid critique. So instance of moral hazards, I've already spoken about. These financial institutions can rely on governments to bail them out from negative consequences of their own actions. The huge moral hazard is the banking industry, globally, right? Too big to fail. When you can collapse an entire investment fund and still get off scot-free, and in fact even get a bonus when you're kicked out. When you don't go to jail, but somebody else goes to jail, somebody else takes the title. We have so many examples of this. And so when we are actually looking at moral hazards and market actors, one of the things that we have to look at is that the more the centrality of the actor or the institution, the greater the moral hazard of the emerging from their behaviors. So in the simple trade diaspora network, moral hazard may emerge as traders distribute risk across networks, and can hypothetically be shielded from facing the consequences of their actions. And very often you actually do find that the traders are accused of this, but when groups come at you and destroy your store, that is a consequence. Instance 2, the guilds or cartels. And there's a low impact over there. When guilds or cartels use their collective bargaining ability, market control to shield themselves from facing the consequences of their actions, low to medium impact. I mean, we have drug cartels that have a high impact, but then again, they actually have to launder their money in order to get even greater impact. But then you go to the diamond industry that also works as a cartel, that have an extremely high impact. And then when you actually have what we call portfolio capitalism and cronyism, when politically connected market actors will start to patronize or give patronage to political actors. So it's no longer politicians sponsoring traders or giving breaks to traders. It is traders demanding breaks from politicians as conditions of their ability to work. And in return, the political actors shield their cronies. So Suharto's regime, for example, in Indonesia, there's an interesting economic study that every time Suharto fell sick, the shares of his cronies actually would fall. The beautiful correlation. And it's almost not one of the spurious ones, because there's actually a very good reason underlying this. And the last one, of course, is state sponsorship of capture or conquest, when a group of traders or business people will essentially take over a state. Either they sponsor the state, so they are the primary decision makers. And this is high or extremely high impact on policies in terms of a moral hazard. And so basically traded markets are spaces for moral hazards because they're always contested between the political and economic actors. There's a reason, there's need for them, there's also envy of them, and there's of course different forms of capital and credit. When we think of capital, we think of economic capital, but as the work of Lynn Ostrom, Nan Lin, so many people has actually demonstrated, and anthropologists as well, there are so many different forms of capital and credit, and how to use them, how to convert your economic capital into political capital, how to convert it into ideological capital. And basically a lot of it rests on this trader or this business person's ability to generate capital, and even more important, to absolve debt. To move across borders, to flee, but mainly to absolve debt. So even though this ability was known to various people in the first millennium AD and so on and so forth, it really becomes a thing in the 17th century, as recorded by De Vries in Holland, that this is where the trader actually comes in. So the state, instead of drawing from its own revenue, is taking a loan. And so what's happening in the 16th century? And now I'm going to just quickly go through these. So here's the Ottoman, the Safavid, and the Mughal empires. And as you can see, this is from the 15th century all the way to the end of the 17th century. Same thing here, the beginning of the 18th century. And then this is, again, the beginning of the 18th century. 3 families. And when you actually look at the reigns, right? 3 dynasties and 200 years of détente. I went through all these documents about Mughal, Persian, Ottoman, Mughal-Ottoman relationships. And basically what happened was that there were limitations. They fought battles, but they were never ready to commit themselves to wars or conquest. They had borders, and they had a lot of diplomatic things that are actually going on. And I actually did a study where I actually looked at 78 polities in Asia, Europe, and Africa from the early modern era down to the present period. And I just did a very simple shorthand test of stability, which is to look at the duration of the dynasty and divide it by the number of rulers. Because for traders, the turnover is a very important mark of stability. If I'm dealing with one person and next year that person is not there, I have to reassess my business plan. I have to work with this person again to get a relationship. And we actually looked at this, and this is the average reign across these and these ones. from 1400 to 1800, it actually goes up to 23.1. And I'm not even looking at the parliamentary systems of Europe or the US at this time. And these are only monarchical groups. And this difference is quite statistically significant. And so basically the moral hazard 1 and 2, the trade networks and the guilds and everything, characterized most of the old world prior to the 14th century. The level of the hazard was low medium. Between the 15th and 16th, 17th centuries, there's a convergence of the old and new worlds. Expansion of metal base, all this beautiful new world, gold and silver. Now where is all that gold and silver going? If it was not going into the roofs of these wonderful Gothic cathedrals that were being built in Southern Europe or Spain or others, it was flowing into India or China by for trade, especially with silver. And you actually have a large growth of politically stable polities, and your centralization actually is taking place, and standardization from south, all the way from Southeast Asia to Europe. So that's when you actually start to get the emergence of moral hazard 3 and 4. So this is when predatory commerce and finance and colonialism actually starts to become pretty big. There's a decline of guilds, and in one of the earlier figures that is shown how the network bifurcation happens. So you got these few big actors at the top, and of course the old trader network continues as before, but it's the big actors that are controlling a vast amount of the trade, but especially they control business and banking and finance because of the rise of the great firm. Here I'm drawing a lot from the work of Karen Leonard, who's written a lot about the role of the letter of credit or as an instrument of state financial management. You have a large empire, you need to bring all your revenue from over 500 or 600 kilometers in. The road might be waylaid by bandits and so on and so forth, and a lot of your revenue drawn in kind. What do? You go to a branch of a bank, and they will give you a letter of credit, and it's that instrument that essentially takes place. And when I did my ethnographies, they showed me the documentation where not only were they using, they were charging commission on that, but they also used that to create floats for short-term investments, for playing futures markets, or if there's a famine or so on and so forth. And these are some of the examples of the letter of credit from South Asia. And so this is that what I was talking about, imperial detente. You can actually see that these are some of the richest areas in the world. Here's the Ming dynasty, and there's a lot of different large polities that are developing here across that are bringing much more stability. And when I say stability, it's not that there were no wars or so on and so forth. It was that these empires lasted. And there was trade friendliness, there was rationing of trade and commercial production, and suddenly you actually see the trader status rise to the level that it hadn't before. And then of course this famine commerce that has always been there when you make large amounts of money based on the stark differentials in availability and resources, but when you can play both sides, you can actually make a lot of money from it. And this was just this chart that I made that I essentially documented, just looked at what would be the sum total of the relationship of the polities in the Indian Ocean be. And basically, the Portuguese are basically fighting with everybody. But most of the time, these have what we call relationships that are diplomatically managed. They're not all good, they're not all bad. And this is the detente I was talking about. And this is that bifurcation that takes place. So earlier you have this trading alliance network, and then you have these portfolio capitalists and bankers on the top, and you get the great bankers emerging in the late 17th century, the mid to late 17th centuries, especially the great banking houses of Surat and so on and so forth, whose clients included not only the various polities in South Asia and the Middle East, but also the British East India Company, the Portuguese, and so on and so forth. Business suddenly becomes respectable, and one of the things about respectable business is that it's very often predatory business. It's there's an old saying in East Africa, and that when you shake hands with an Indian, count the number of fingers you have left. When, and even East African Indians actually now say that about Indians from India. And because you become respectable because you have a large amount of capital, but definitely to gain that amount of capital, you had to do some things that were not that respectable. And there's a change in merchant status. I mean, you actually have people buying up these official posts, and even though the Mughal emperor nominally says he thinks of trade as something low, he's starting to depend on that particular revenue. And you start to get merchants becoming the Mughal nobility first in Gujarat, then across South Asia, and then you suddenly have the rise of these pressure groups in the South Asian empire. These, and then the 16th and 17th centuries, a similar process actually happening in Western Europe as well, especially in the Dutch and the Belgian areas. The only difference there is that they did not come, that for whatever their production was, it was definitely not even anything compared to the ones in Asia. And yeah. So you get a bifurcation, and then what happens is that they get power or polity due to their ability to both absorb debt and to resolve disputes through capital. So when Emperor Akbar's mother was blocked from going to Surat by the Portuguese, nothing he could do would stop her, would convince the Portuguese. An unnamed Hindu trader from Cambay actually resolved the issue by giving the Portuguese like a few % discount on the monies that they owed him. In return for that, he recouped everything from the Mughal emperor. Right? So here's economic capital now actually flexing its power. And this is in the late 16th century. And that's when I said business becomes predatory, you get emergence of cronyism, commerce with impunity, and there's no self-restraint anymore. Because the idea is you restrain yourself, otherwise they will restrain you. But you don't need to do that because even if you don't restrain yourself, they will protect you, they have to, they're dependent. Right? And that's what you then get is mass production for dumping goods in markets, peripheral markets. That's what you find in East Africa. Indian goods just dumped there, South Asia. Competitive imitative production for market capture. Insistence on raw materials as opposed to finished goods. So we don't want cut ivory, we want raw ivory. And so this is North African glazed, these are a particular kind of glazeware called the monochrome glazewares, and mainly we thought that they were made in the Middle East and North Africa. But then we found Suraj Bhan, one of the people I worked with, he found this ceramic production complex, this huge, very ancient production complex in Gujarat, in India, called Khambhat, and in Lashkar Shah site. And so we got samples from there, and when we actually tested the ones that we knew were from Western Asia, and the ones from Untwapa, which is a port on the east coast of Africa, we actually found that majority of the samples from Untwapa that we tested actually came, and these were randomly selected. We did not select them looking at anything, we just selected, we had a sampling strategy, and most of them were essentially made in India. So what we think is that the classic Middle Eastern manufacture is actually being made at a site in India, and I have to tell you, these are actually pretty crappy. The glaze is thin, the fabric is reddish and coarse. These are beautiful. The glazes are thick, they're made, this is like a buff, beautiful buff, cream colored wear, and so on and so forth. And you still find a few pieces like these, but the bulk of them were actually from India. So we know that what I was talking about here is actually going on as we are testing it archaeologically. And so I'm just essentially going to, this was one of the few things that they're dumping. They were really starting to dump cloth. I was speaking with Adam Green at King's College, which had told me that South Asian cloth is not only dumped in East Africa, destroying the East African cloth industry by the 1700s, but even by that time, it had actually moved to West Africa, destroying a lot of West African cloth industries as well. And the Mughals, they actually really supported it because they were also getting extremely indebted to the traders, and they were also dependent on this trade. So this is the ivory, number of elephants and number of slaves that were taken out, and these are just the European company records. The Indians were importing much more, and you can actually see the total number of polities that were importing these, and you can actually see as there's consolidation through the years, the amount actually goes up, and it's actually a jump in this particular period. We are talking about different levels now. And these are the two places where I did my excavations. So Chaul in India, this is an old colony airport, and this is Untwapa. Okay. This is just a thing that both Chaul and Untwapa essentially, Chaul declined to a small regional center right around this particular time, and Untwapa just was completely abandoned. And both of them were actually a large part of the Indian Ocean trade between about 900 AD to the ultimate collapse. These were some of the places we excavated. And this is what we find. So this is Untwapa, this is 1400 to 1500, and these are blue and white ceramics, glazeware, and celadons. Much more equal distribution in these areas here. It's all focused in this particular area, which is a public area, public mosque. And so when we did the same thing in Chaul, I said, I expect that, and this is Chaul, 1400 to 1600. This is the same distribution. This is the public bath area, Hammam Khan of Chaul. So now, what we actually do is we come to what is called state capture. The state capture is essentially when South Asian traders are already playing with the informal state sponsorship in East Africa, where the elites are being coerced into disinvesting in their own industries and taking in cheap Indian cloth and exporting raw ivory and so on and so forth. The irony of irony is that the British East India Company actually did that to the Indians. I said they learned very well. And there was actually large reasons for that. I'm actually going to go through it. This is more of an addendum. But basically, the Europeans were extremely dependent upon their Asian partners, but they were actually much more credit-worthy than the Asian princes. So the Asian trader that you love preferred to deal with the Europeans more than they preferred to deal with the princes. It's like business people prefer to deal with each other rather than some political actor, right? That's nothing. And so 1757 is this turning point when a small battle between Robert Clive and the British East India Company and the Nawab Suraj-ud-Dawla of Bengal turns into a decisive victory for Clive. But the Mughal emperor named the British East India Company Company Bahadur, or the Brave Company, for his own reasons. He didn't have any power at that time, and he thought, if I bring in the British East India Company, then I'll get back Bengal. Little did he realize that he would just lose all of India after that. But what it did was that it actually gave them the right to collect rents and taxes in Bengal, and then it created not only capital for expansion, but unprecedented access to South Asian cloth for the China trade. And it creates a new form of colonialism as well. The policy started in Bengal, but urged in Bombay. So here you have a few policy suggestions. Henry Douglas, if China could be supplied by the sale of Indian manufacture, render the bed for India perfect. And it says acquisition of these towns. So it's not just buying. So it's better to buy, but it's even better to control. Right? And so basically what happens is, so this is Charles Mallet in the Bombay factory urging pretty much the same thing. And then, I don't know how many of you have seen Pride and Prejudice. I've read Pride, I think all of you have read Pride and Prejudice or Vanity Fair or anything. Those tussles that were taking place between the British landed gentry and those who had made their money in trade. These tussles have been going on for a long time. And even Adam Smith was very, very uncomfortable about this. You know, he says, traders by strange absurdity regard the character of the sovereign as but an appendix to that of a trader, as something which ought to be made subservient to it. Adam Smith actually didn't like, because he actually thought that control of the polity by traders was actually this form of mercantilism that was very problematic. control of the poverty by big traders was even more problematic. He didn't believe in the empire. He says, we might be shopkeepers, but it is fit for a nation that is governed by shopkeepers, which he didn't want. And so then, of course, you have the British who expanded control in the hinterland, cloth industries across Bengal, local manufacture declined, all of the cash cropping for cotton, later opium, tea, and other commodities, and the beauty of this was bankrolled by South Asian traders. So Freddie Mercury, who is the descendant of Zanzibari Parsi business family, the Balsara family, they actually invested a lot in the slavery ivory complex and in the opium trade complex. And so basically, even though the British East India Company took over Bengal and the rest of the part, they still continued partnering with Indian merchants who capitalized not only their economic activities but also their war activities. And then, there's an ivory cloth dyad that was pre-1800, and basically what happened was that the Chinese would only take silver bullion, but if you ask them what you really want, if not bullion, they'd say ivory. And where was the best ivory coming from? East Africa. So basically what happened was that East African ivories would be purchased from the Swahili coast by Indians for 15 to 19 rupees per kilo and brought to South Asia, and the same ivory was being sold for 3 to 6 rupees per kilo. And the question is, how is this sustainable? And that's because cloth that they're pricing at 15 to 19 rupees per kilo is actually worth pennies on this amount, even with the transfer of the transaction cloth and so on of cloth. For the Africans, ivory was so plentiful that they were giving it away. For the Indians, they were flooding the markets, so they were getting what they were calling extremely expensive ivory for very cheap cloth. So by the time they got it back, they were actually able to sell it to the Chinese for this particular amount. And for the Chinese, this was wonderful, cloth for ivory. When I saw these figures, I was very surprised because this is the opposite of any business model I know, until I actually looked at the relative prices of these commodities in each of these places. I'm like, oh, okay, it makes sense. So they're making a profit here, they're also making a profit here, excepting that for the Africans, ivory was practically free, especially in the early periods. I mean, prior to the 20th century, there's so much of it in the hinterland that they could bring as much of it and they could release it. So, that becomes the opium tea, ivory trade opium triad. So what you essentially get is cash cropping of opium in Bengal, opium offered to Chinese for tea and silver. There's a reversal of the silver. Silver not flowing into China, silver flowing out of China, mass opium addiction in China, and the emergence of black tea plantation economy in Bengal, and so on and so forth, reduction of demand for Chinese tea. So Tan Chung actually said it very well: tea for the British, opium for the Chinese, and colonialism for the Indians. And to add to Chung, morally hazard capitalism for the entire world. And this is just an example of what's actually going on. So I'm not saying that this caused everything. This is actually an example of similar things that are actually going on all over the world. And as I say, all highly addictive in their own ways. And so summing up, that basically what happens is that motivations, agendas are simultaneously in concord and conflict. The expansion of markets leads to growth, but is also beset with hazards, where some actors actually behave with impunity. And the role of political elite in determining fiscal policies of state continues to be challenged, and it was always challenged. And state capture or oligarchic mechanisms has become the norm, but it started in this particular period across the world. And only the authoritarian governments like China and Russia can actually challenge moral hazard 3, but they have their own moral hazards that essentially emerge. So I'm going to do a 3-minute second tale, 3 minutes, of capitalism giveth and taketh to markets. Basically, this happened when I went to this place here. This is Kakuma. This is East Africa here, and Kakuma. There's a bigger camp over there. Kakuma camp now has about 200,000 people, And this is my research area right now. And I work with all these different groups in Kakuma and to some extent in the lab as well. And we've been funded by the State Department and USAID and by UNHCR and the World Bank as well to understand how trade actually helps Kakuma and how it doesn't. That's my own ambition. And one of the things that we realized was that everybody in the development world talks about dignity. How many of you have seen talks or missions or NGOs and everything where dignity is used, right? Everybody speaks of dignity. You ask them what it means and people are like, I don't know. And it's not really their fault. Most of us would know dignity, might know dignity when we see it, but if you're pressed, it would be really hard to define it. It's culturally variable and so on and so forth, right? But fun enough, most of us recognize indignity when we actually see it. No matter how horrible a person Gaddafi was, when he was pulled out from the sewer like a rat and then shot, executed, all of us, well, I know I did, felt, that was not a good way to die. That demeaned the people around him. And, no matter what he did, right? So basically what we did was that we decided to say, what gives dignity? And a lot of it actually came from the people themselves, because they all, of course, everybody has words for dignity. And the reason is that development has to understand the concept of indignity, because indignity can emerge from a lot of things in a form of relationship, or also hatred, dislike, superiority, but mainly indifference. When you become reduced to a number, or you become like, you look through someone. Like the homeless. When you look through a homeless person, that's the most because you are rejecting a relationship. That's the basic level. And as I said, like inconsequentiality and so on and so forth. So this was when I mapped out all the market systems in Kakuma. So I've been working there from 2008. And in 2015, we mapped all the stores in 2,031 stores, selling anything and everything. You want to buy anything, you can actually get it there, cash and credit. And this is essentially the way that food and cash flows within this particular camp. And this is a stark area. And this is one of the places where you get unexpected entrepreneurs. This young boy makes yeast so that people can buy the little packets and make injera for Ethiopian or Somali food. This man takes all the flour and makes bread. This young boy pumps bicycles. And even the refugees actually need domestic help. So you get this Turkana man and this Turkana woman who are getting water for the refugees. And there's a large trading network over here. And basically what we wanted to do, and this was the World Bank, they wanted to break the myths of refugees as burdens, homogenous, illiterate, dependent, dangerous, competitors. And this was two Somali family networks that essentially I mapped all the way from Kitale down in southwestern Kenya to Juba in South Sudan. I followed them as they negotiated past various things. This was in Kakuma camp itself when we essentially mapped out all the trade networks. These are based on historical memory, and these are actually based on going to all these places and then jotting them down. We were able to do network analysis on the various traders, and you can essentially see when there's high instability and a lot of predatory regulation, people come together. They're more cooperative here. So the blue is politically connected traders and the red is... so these ones are indistinguishable from each other during times of high instability and high regulation. But during times of high stability and low regulation, so good times for business people, you can actually see these two groups actually splitting apart, which means... So what we were actually demonstrating from the ethnography is actually shown through quantitative means. And basically, the anthropological part is that it's not just about demand. There's something more there. And it's about when you buy clothes in a refugee camp, you're purchasing some normalcy. You're actually gaining some dignity when you can buy a perfume for your husband as a gift on your wedding anniversary, right? And the camp, as I said, provides employment for the local people. But this is a warehouse So this is essentially a workshop built by a Somali woman. It's a two-story shop in the midst of this refugee camp. And she actually makes wedding furniture, handcrafted wedding furniture, beautiful stuff. And when I went there, she was building this. There's a exercise room here, workout station here. On a second story, there's a clothing boutique, an internet cafe, and an Ethiopian buna, the coffee shop. And this can come across as a surprise, but basically refugees are people with skills and so on and so forth, and they, like any humans, are going to consume. And again, you're buying dignity, you're purchasing some normalcy. This was just a wedding that I attended, and the same kind of stuff that you will see at any wedding here, the bride actually turned quite difficult, and we all had to work very hard to calm her down. It was not her fault. I mean, she got locked out of the car for 15 minutes. The whole wedding party is waiting on one side of the road, and the bride and the groom can't get into the car. It was bespattered with mud. Her hair was not done well. The groom said he ran out of money halfway, and then we all had to chip in to make sure that he could sing thing as usual. And the local people, the Turkana people, are some of the most impoverished people in the world, and they're really excluded. You can actually see that they make some of the best goats in the world, but it's the non-local traders who essentially buy them as a cartel, and then they send them to regional markets. So local traders usually, essentially, these producers usually only get up to 300 to 1,000 shillings per goat. By the time it comes to Nairobi, it's actually 8,000 above per goat. And because the people above are buying, they can set a price ceiling, and you can't break it. The same thing with the camel trade. Because the people here are setting a ceiling of 75,000, these ones can't actually break that particular ceiling. But I don't know why this always happens here. But when we wanted to see, okay, is the presence of the refugees in the markets actually helping or harming the local Turkana community? We actually did 150 people from Kakuma and then 150 people in 3 different localities, so 600 people in total, and we took some skin photos from them to look at their body fat percentage, which is a good marker for nutritional status. And we actually found that this is Kakuma for women, and this is a developed place within Turkana, highly developed place. There was no difference between Kakuma and this developed place. These are 2 undeveloped localities, significant difference for both women and men. The hosts of Kakuma have better nutritional status because they have access through food and cash to markets, access to hospitals and healthcare. But it's more varied because they also show more inequality. And when we looked at perceptions, the proportion of host community reporting negative refugee impacts at the non-violent and violent, we essentially see that there's not that much difference here. And this is the further away you go from the camp. Again, this one is lower, but but when you actually look at positive perceptions, the people living closest to the camp have high positive perceptions. The further you go away from the camp, have low perceptions. The World Bank people were just like, this is incredible. Because this was actually what caused Jim Kim to then put in more money towards a lot of these refugee programs. These findings. Again, we look at the distance from the camp and positive and negative perceptions. Negative perceptions, not too many. Positive, it declines. And so what you have is that there's a lot of indignity or indifference for the hosts over here. Exclusion from markets, depleted livestock, low levels of education, worker served for the refugees, and they cannot intersect with the market. And it's a murky relationship where refugees also have a lot of indignity. And in both of them, the idea of indignity, of getting dignity, is to normalize life. And that includes investing in agented consumption, sharing your food and material comforts to the mainstream black market. You don't buy a candy to eat by yourself. You can. But you buy a candy for your child because your child is asking for it, and you might have been a shop owner back in Somalia, and now you feel wretched because you can't do anything. So if you sell a little bit of your food, you go to the black market, you can buy a little bit of candy. You can buy some samosas for Ramadan. You feel normal. You feel a normal person. And they'll do this despite the humiliation of debt. So if they get indebted to the shopkeepers, and despite general attrition to the food process. And the dignity of hope is kept alive through small acts of agented consumption. Okay. almost admit. For the Turkana, the local people, again, they benefit, but again, it's the exclusion from the market, both because they don't want it themselves, but also because it's hard for them to actually be a part of the market, but they benefit from the refugee presence, and they live with this margin indignity because they can get some access to the market that way. And so, for refugees, consuming like normal people, for Turkana, consuming like normal people, it's very important, and the market actually is a way to regain this dignity. So we essentially came to this, and one of the things that I asked the UNHCR people, why did you select my research for essentially, for consulting or anything like that? And because I said this is not unique, what I've essentially shown, a lot of anthropologists have also said, Lisa Malki, Graham Jensen, and so on and so forth, and they said it's because you did not actually demonize either the traders or the UN or the World Food Program. You kind of understood what our constraints were. You understood what we could and we couldn't do, both from a policy prescriptive level as well as the local feasibility level. And in so doing, you essentially showed us a way, or your work showed us a way to essentially actually operationalize dignity, because here are people saying, when I buy a goat for a feast to celebrate my daughter's birth, I feel like a person. I cannot do that with the corn and beans, boiled corn and beans given by the World Food Program, right? And it's essentially that there's something tangible here. And that's what essentially started making the difference. So getting UNHCR and World Bank on board was and now of course, because the State Department in the USA is also very interested in this research, because in a sense it is now being applied. I just received word on Sunday that this summer all of the recommendations that we made when I gave a debrief to USA and to the World Food Program, they're actually already implementing our suggestions, and that makes me happy, because even before the final report is written, if policymakers are actually taking your ideas seriously and implementing them, then that's exactly what we want as engaged anthropologists. So what do these two tales tell us? Capitalism as a force, because I've been talking about capitalism in both instances, and they look very different. But it's a force that has complex underpinnings, process mechanisms that are culturally variable. It might not look the same to you. It's the driver, but it's also an outcome. So when we think of capitalism, we also think of it as an outcome of the relationship between needs, experiences, and realities. And it can also serve both as a solution to some of the issues, but it can also be a problem. It also creates problems. And for me, this is this deep-held belief that I've had, which is why I loved anthropology. Even after finding out that a lot of it is counting potsherds and stone chips and everything like that, or from the ethnographic viewpoint, like counting all the links and doing the analysis on them, we have the largest data set of human behaviors across space and through time. Nobody has a bigger data set than us. And it's acknowledged by the sociologists, the economists, so on and so forth. But there's also a growing crisis of irrelevance. And how many of us have discussed this in our meetings, right? Obama's Council on Race did not have an anthropologist on it. When we were talking about the World Bank on the Society for Economic Anthropology pages, a lot of the older, senior anthropologists were like, this is good, this is engaged, and so on and so forth. But a lot of the people were actually like, the World Bank is a hateful organization, they're evil, and we need to be in permanent opposition. And like, we could not dream of a better way to gain more irrelevance than if we actually set up a committee to decide, to become irrelevant. And This was actually brought home. I was having a conversation with Paul Collier, who's a major economist at Oxford. He wrote The Bottom Billion, about how there's been upliftment. He's advised the World Bank and everything. And he's an Englishman. And he said to me, I'm going to try and imitate him now. Anthropologists have the best data. They really do. They have the best data. They have data better than anyone. Unfortunately, they don't know what to do with it. It was a classic British backhanded comment, right? It was one of those things. But it actually got me thinking that, the World Bank is not a monolithic organization. We treat it like one. But we don't treat our subjects, our informants or participants in our research as monolithic. We don't treat the villages that we go to do research in as monolithic. The economists tend to do that. So we look at the institutions and think of them as monolithic, oppositional, enemies, and our people need to be protected. And what we need to do is we need to turn our ethnographic gaze and also the archaeological and biological, anthropological gaze to bring together these data sets. Is that I actually think that we have far better answers in conjunction with insights from other disciplines because we actually have the largest data set. So with that, thank you so much, and I'm sorry I spoke for such a long time, but I hope I've got some time for questions.
All right, we have time for a couple questions. Is anyone?
So by means of introduction, I'm an archaeologist and work in what would generally be considered pre-capitalistic times. So I'm curious, in this picture that you were painting at the beginning of sort of traders as being in between spaces, seems very different than the way archaeologists portray communities involved in trade relationships very early on in human history. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you view maybe what would be considered pre-capitalistic trade in relationship to these sorts of networks that you have talked about in your discussion.
Okay, thanks. That's a great question. And first, I'd actually like to talk about pre-capitalist versus capitalist, because to me, that's actually a problematic dichotomy. It's artificial, because if you think of capitalism not as a dominant political system that characterizes our world right now, but as a system, some kind of private ownership over production, distribution, and consumption, then you can actually find it has a much longer history at that particular point. And that was one of those things that I'm trying to point out, because I also started as an archaeologist, but one of the things that it kind of started to become more problematic when I realized that most archaeologists have never done business in their lives. They've never done trade in their lives, right? And a lot of cultural anthropologists have done excellent research on trade, and the twain rarely meet each other. And even when they do, the other problem is that very often we don't want to see these evil capitalist forces in these beautiful pre-capitalist societies, because we want them untainted. So there's this particular ideology. So what I decided to do was say, okay, here are these trading communities that go back a few hundreds or even thousands of years, right? Some of them operate in places that are definitely not your capitalist. So these Somalis who essentially came to work here in, here. So these places here, the Somalis who came here in the 1960s, there was no market systems over here. There was no capitalism over there. This was, how did they operate? And that's essentially because even though the system, there was no capitalist system, there were forms of capitalism that actually were there. So one of the things that I would actually say for archaeologists is to finish reading Polanyi, finish reading a lot of different kind of like anthropological literature. And what we need to do is we need to start reading entrepreneurship literature. We need to start reading ethnographic literature on trade behaviors and so on and so forth. And what we actually need to understand is that the past was probably far more complex than we think it is, but that does not mean that it is unknowable. And one of the things is, instead of trying to assume what kind of exchange relationships must have been, because we think that being a pre-capitalist or a pre-state society precludes or excludes these. Test it. Test it out first, and then we can actually talk about that. We can talk about that more, definitely. But great question. Did I answer your question?
Kind of, part of it. I'm coming to dinner with you though,
Okay.
so I can talk to you.
Yes, you can bet right here. Yes.
First of all, thank you so much. I really appreciate the aspect that there's so much data and trying to synthesize them in a way that illuminates on the question of capitalism from a very historical and contemporary perspective as well. But my question is, so from what I understand from your talk is your focus on capitalism is mainly from the perspective of exchange and circulation, like in the trader network or in the trader diaspora from a more cosmopolitan perspective, if I could say. But how about production and consumption? For example, in Marxist Das Kapital, then his major focus is on production and, of course, circulation, but mainly production and consumption on the production side. And his idea was to mobilize the workers' movement by presenting them a theory that is practical and I would say visionary in a sense. So how would you relate your work to that critique of capitalism? Or if not at all, but I'm curious.
Well, I actually have my own private theory on why Marx, because Marx said industry trumps commerce. And Marx said that because he was writing at a time when industrial technological developments in the industry were far outstripping the technological developments in circulation or distribution, right? Industrial production was essentially like the people in India and China have been experimenting with it for, from the 18th and 17th centuries, and in Europe, of course, it starts to become big. The whole shift away from sail power to steam power actually didn't even become big until after 1850s, right? So by the time Marx had actually written most of his stuff, industry is outstripping commerce. That's no longer the case. Procter & Gamble does not answer to, Walmart does not answer to, Procter & Gamble answers to Walmart. If Walmart says jump, Procter & Gamble says how high, right? And I was talking about this with a bunch of business people, and they said, yes, commerce again trumps industry. Because the cell phone is not a manufactured product for calling people. The smartphone. The smartphone is essentially a vehicle of circulation. Circulation of information, circulation of exchange, circulation of creating networks and so on and so forth. Now this is a much larger conversation, but when you take it back into old societies, I mean, let's say you have limited means of production and everybody is owning their own production, right? People are basically producing for themselves, and yet exchange is already taking place. Exchange is taking place through socially mediated ways, and maybe later on through commercially mediated ways as well. So the idea that we are focusing on any one thing is problematic. The reason I focus on distribution is because it is that which enables something that is produced to be consumed and for that whole process to start again. For example, it doesn't matter how hard you work to produce something and how much cost it has. If nobody wants to buy it, it's going to rot in your warehouse, right? And that's one of those things, the difference between the Marxist approach, control over means of production, and Veblen's thing. It's not about what you produce and the cost. It's about if people will buy it and how much they will pay to buy it, right? So you have these competing economic thoughts, and Marx, I think, was writing at a time when it made a lot of sense. Right now, I think Marx might actually think differently.
although I do not actually agree with the last point, but the reason why I asked that question is actually directed toward your comment on the question of the morality. Because you said you wanted to talk about capitalism as a system, as an economic and political system, while put aside the moral question. But for example, if you look not just Marx, but actually if you trace it back to Adam Smith, then his philosophy of the wealth of the nation is actually a moral philosophy as well. Who is more concerned about after we accumulate so much wealth, what are we going to do with that wealth? And the process of procuring that wealth, how does it impact the society in a moral way? So, I mean, can we really talk about capitalism without talking about morality?
But whose morality?
Yeah, that is the question.
Which is why for me that's such a thorny question, because it's whose cultural morality are we talking about? And so what we first want to do is we want to look at the process, and then we can deal with all the thorny questions of the moralities that actually emerge. Because what is morality for Indian philosophers or Chinese philosophers, or might not be the same for African philosophers, right? So which is why it's like you get caught up in those weeds, and I think that's where we are. We are a lot of this activist thinking is actually in the weeds, and it's because of the ravages. But we definitely need to pay heed to that.
So you conceive morality as a metaphysical question instead of something that is more like formative, so like morality of doing things instead of morality of as a kind of philosophical debate.
No, it's not. It's a very real debate. It's a very pragmatic debate.
Right.
But I don't want to get into those weeds, because the question again is, whose morality? Right? Even in real terms, morality has a price and morality has impacts. The question is, whose morality is what is operating?
Yeah, exactly, because like, there's a positionality in morality. There's also positionality in trade and in all those transactions. And can we really debunk those two kind of connections?
No, I'm not debunking them. I'm saying that right now, for our particular purposes, when we inject morality, what we do is, it's kind of like trying to look into the bottom of something and saying, let's add coloring agent, because it will actually make the picture more complex. It necessarily does. So the idea is not so much to actually discount it, but to discount a particular knee-jerk response to it, right? Because a lot of morality is actually knee-jerk responses. It's very culturally and temporally constrained. It's based on what we want to think of morality. I mean, right now this country is so polarized, and the concept of morality on the part of the alt-right and the part of the alt-left are almost polar opposite, accepting that they both really, really do believe in the sense of morality. Disentangling that, I mean, that's why I prefer to actually say, okay, let's actually look at what the process is. Let's look at the process in history. Let's create the testable. Let's look at what is happening, and then we can actually start to look at how things are distributed, questions of fairness, questions of justice, and so on and so forth, which is, like when I become older and grayer and I've done all my field work, then I can start looking at.
Any other questions from people who are not in the seminar? Because then we can shift to the seminar. Yes.
A couple of weeks ago, we had another speaker here, Professor Licht, who made the argument that the very term capitalism was problematic and possibly useless. Do you deal with that at all? I mean, is part of the issue that you're looking at a range of human behavior that includes vast, it's quite large in time and space. Does capitalism as a term, is that a construct you can put around it and have any meaning, or is it just kind of a latter day kind of bugaboo stuck on top of all this?
Well, my answer to your question would actually, I'm not trying to be like flippant, it would be yes and no. And of course, that's a question that we all have answered in in various ways, the yes and no part. But as I said before, I mean, when I started to talk about capitalism, I realized that my parameters were becoming so general as to be so applicable, but then maybe not having any utility. But for me, I think sometimes fighting with terms has become like tilting at windmills. It is a term, it's going to be there, it's going to be used across the disciplines and so on and so forth, whether we like it or not. So I go with the Bob Hunt, he's an economic anthropologist at Brandeis school, where it says, if you get a term, define it, define the parameters, whether they're general or not, and then move along. I think it has applications because there's certain that basically that term is so used across so many disciplines that to jettison it entirely, we'll have to come up with something that, as we say in cluster analysis, right? If you have a sample size of 200, how many clusters can you actually form? 200, right? So similarly, I mean, for me, I regard myself more as a lumper rather than a splitter. So I'd rather take a particular term, look at all the manners of sins that it actually covers, and then say, okay, here's what I'm talking about in this particular instance. Here's what I'm talking about in this particular instance. Here are the differences, but here are some of the structural similarities that we are seeing, and that's why I'm using the same term to actually call them capitalism. It's much more functional. Because when I was in my first and second year of grad school, I took grave umbrage to Tim Earle's use of the word chiefdoms. I did. And also to the band tribe chiefdom state model, like most of us have, right? It becomes a straw man at some particular point. So a few years ago, Tim invited me to become part of a session on moving beyond Morgan and typology. And he and I had spoken about this when I was in grad school. No more typologies. And to his surprise, I actually came up with a paper that actually said, yeah, let's move away from the evolutionary typology of bands becoming tribes, becoming chiefdoms, becoming states, but let's keep those terms because they might actually have some heuristic value. They might actually have some value. And yeah, he was surprised when I actually said that. And it kind of became a term because capitalism, tribe, band, these have capital by themselves now. So for me, just a wholesale jettisoning of those or saying that it doesn't apply, I think we can do more. We can do more by essentially working with the parameters rather than tilting at that particular windmill. But that's just my opinion.
Thank you very much, Rahul.